go outside, get sun, touch grass, meet people in real life, try to act online how you act in real life, try to be conscious of the algorithm in a similar way that we're trying to be conscious about food more and more. I think a conscious life can be a hopeful life.
Greetings and salutations, my fellow plebs. My name is Walker, and this is the Bitcoin Podcast. Bitcoin time chain is 855-822, and the value of one Bitcoin is still one Bitcoin. Today's episode is Bitcoin Talk, where I talk with my guest about Bitcoin and whatever else comes up. Today, that guest is the one and only Lyn Alden. Lyn is my go-to resource for logical and nuanced takes on all the insanity in our world, and she is also one of the best memers in the business. Now, usually Lyn's podcast appearances focus on macro, and obviously she's an expert in that. And they often also get spun into some sort of doom and gloom YouTube thumbnails later on. So for this show today, I decided to go a completely different route with Lyn. And we talk about freedom technology and reasons to be hopeful about the future. We dig into Fedi, Nostr, Lightning, Bitcoin more generally, and discuss Bitcoin adoption by corporations and nation states. We also talk about what she and Ego Death Capital look for when investing in Bitcoin companies and what makes her excited about all the development going on in the open source space. I also ask one macro question at the very end about the Fed because I just couldn't help myself. I think you're going to enjoy the heck out of this show, and I hope it gives you a lot of hope for the future. Before we dive in, do me a favor and subscribe to the Bitcoin Podcast wherever you're watching or listening, and check out my sponsor Bitbox in the show notes, or you can go directly to bitbox.swiss/Walker and use the promo code Walker for 5% off the fully open source, Bitcoin only Bitbox O2 hardware wallet. You can also grab links to protect yourself from SIM swap attacks using Efani and Cloaked Wireless. You can pick which one you'd like. I am a one-man show, so when you use my partner links, it genuinely helps me keep this show running, and I really appreciate it. If you'd rather watch this show than listen, head to the show notes for links to watch on YouTube, Rumble, and now on Nostr via Highlighter. But if you're like me and you prefer to just listen to your podcast while doing something else, I highly recommend you check out Fountain.fm. Not only can you send Bitcoin to your favorite podcasters to give value for value, but you can earn Bitcoin just for listening to this show. Finally, if you are a Bitcoin-only company interested in sponsoring the Bitcoin Podcast, hit me up on social media or through the website bitcoinpodcast.net. Without further ado, let's get into this Bitcoin talk with Lyn Alden. Lyn, thanks so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you on here.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
I usually start these out by asking who you are, how you got here today. I know that everybody probably at this point knows who you are. You've been on, I just saw today, 4.4% of Peter McCormack's podcasts, which is an impressive stat. You are, the queen of ratios on X, chancellor of Nothing Stops This Train memes. And, so I do have to ask, even though folks know, how did you get here today? How did this all shake out? Did it just fall into your lap because of who you are and how you operate, or was this any sort of a conscious effort? How did you arrive at this point?
A lot of it was an accident. Basically, the intentional part was that I always wanted to kind of have a side hustle or do more than I'm doing at my job. So I started a first blog back in 2010. It was talking about stocks, just kind of like, I was like working as an engineer, coming out of college, talking about stocks. It's kind of like my passion. I made a little bit of money on the side. I eventually sold that one. And then I decided, okay, I'm going to go a little bit broader, talk about kind of financial assets in general. And so I started, Lyn Alden Investment Strategy. And I expected it to be, successful, like a secondary source of income. But then it just blew up so much. I mean, first what I did was I would actually read other blogs about how to kind of make a successful blog. There was like this kind of circular thing back then of like, good information online. It's okay. So I was intentional in the sense that I was like, okay, what makes a blog successful? One of the strategies was basically if you're going to write about something, write the 10x better article on that thing. like write the go-to. Don't just add to the noise out there. So I'd go for quality over quantity. I did a little bit of search engine optimization, nothing crazy, but just like making sure I rank well back when that was a big deal in the 2010s. Um, and so combination of those intentional things made it fairly successful. And then at first I was not very good at social media. I would just kind of like post links to my articles on social media. I was kind of not really present. But financial Twitter was so interesting that I got pulled into it. And I never really expected to be good at social media or like, and I certainly didn't expect that like I'm an introvert, so talking is I'm like shocked people want to listen to like my interviews and stuff. Um, and so it kind of just kept snowballing. And I eventually had to leave my engineering profession because all my research and media became so big.
It's a good problem to have, I suppose, to have that side hustle become in fact, the main hustle. And yeah, as far as people wanting to hear you talk, I think that much is clear. I think perhaps besides Sailor, you have to be, and maybe you've eclipsed him at this point, I'm not sure, but your podcast appearances are prolific. And yeah, it's quite impressive. Just again, as we were talking before this, I listened to the one you had with Peter earlier today. It was great as always. Again, 4.4% of his total episodes is quite impressive because he's put out a lot of episodes. And because you have all these appearances, you get asked these macro questions a lot. And I really want to try and take this in a little bit of a different direction so that folks, if they'd like to hear about the yen and all of that, go check out what Bitcoin did because you just recorded a fantastic episode on it today that really breaks it down well. But here on this little show, I'd love to kind of take it in the direction of Bitcoin, technology, freedom tech in general, open source projects that are coming out right now. Nostr, to talk about Fedi a little bit too, which just launched yesterday. And I know you, as part of Ego Death Capital, you guys were an early investor in Fedi. So I'd love to just kind of start there. But maybe before we get into that, I could ask you a more general question to set the stage, which is it's something I think about a lot, and I struggle with a little bit to put these in the correct order. And the things I'm trying to order are money, technology, culture, politics, law, and which is upstream and which is downstream of which is the forcing function on the other, which is the prime catalyst, and which is just being affected by the other. Do you have any sense of, or I guess what, in your opinion, if you had to order money, technology, culture, politics, law, where do you put those in the upstream versus downstream flow of things?
That's a really good question. That would require more thought than on the spot. I would say I certainly rank technology very high because technology basically changes things permanently and everywhere. That's a point that I made in my book, is that people focus on monetary decisions like in a given country or something, and of course they impact that country, they can have broader implications. But if you like invent refrigeration, you've like that's a one directional thing. Unless we like wipe out civilization, that is a permanent achievement that spreads everywhere. um, and so we accumulate those technological growth for the most part, and it doesn't stay in one area. It just becomes a permanent change. And then one of the things I focus on in Broken Money is that technology changes how we interact with money and what we use as money. So to some extent I would put technology upstream of money. I do think law can impact technology in the sense that, I mean, there's a reason why so much innovation comes out of the United States. We have basically a legal hub, capital, kind of all of our laws are really good for startups, and there's this whole kind of ecosystem in place for making sure that they get funding, and a culture of support for that. So that can accelerate technology that happens. Like there's more technology coming out of certain legal structures than others. But in the grand scheme of things, if some country's not doing it, some other country eventually will anyway. So ultimately, I kind of put technology near the top, and then money would also be pretty near the top because money has a big impact on laws. It has a big impact on society as a whole. A lot of times you'll see social revolutions happen, and it's often something happened with the money or something happened economically that they might not be mad about like they're mad about that, but they might even be taking it out on something else, something more social perhaps. But what they're really angry about is their economic situation, which is harder to quantify or put into words. So I would put technology probably near the top, and then money and law, kind of goes down from there.
I think that's a very fair characterization. And the reason I ask is to just sort of to set the stage for some of these topics I want to explore with you next, which is, and something you talk about in Broken Money, just this idea that money as a technology has not meaningfully improved in a very long time, even though technology itself very much has. But money really was lagging behind that in terms of how we were using it, how it was created. I suppose we got very accustomed to just typing in a keyboard to create new units of this currency digitally. So we did catch up in that regard. But now we're at this really cool inflection point where we have Bitcoin. We have other technologies like Ecash and federated Ecash and the Lightning Network on top of Bitcoin. We have companies like Fedi who are using all of these solutions lumped into one to create this super app, which they have now just made open source. And I'd love to just kind of, I guess, get your take a little bit on how you see, maybe from the investor standpoint at ego death, but then also from kind of just you as an individual, as a human engaging in action here. How do you see this sort of shifting the tide in terms of what cultural and political changes may actually be possible because we finally have a money that is caught up with where we are as a global, don't want to say global society, but as humanity?
Yeah, so technology can change what we have like available and kind of where sources of power reside. And so in the era where we have fast transactions, thanks to starting from the telegraph and extending to the internet, but we had slow settlements because we didn't really have a way to do fast digital settlements. We became reliant on these big centralized ledgers, which inherently became captured and controlled by nation states. And that's a valley that was very hard to get out of. You can't like really wasn't that many good solutions for it, and in over 100 countries worldwide, you never really saw any country actually change that. Not like there's no other way that it's really been done in this era. It shows how hard the problem is. It's more than just human decisions. It's kind of like the technology we have to work with and how that tilts power very strongly to likely come out in a certain direction. And the invention of Bitcoin is basically the invention of fast settlements. So we finally have closed that speed gap, which means it's possible to have money in the telecommunication era that does not reside on someone's credit-based ledger. And that's powerful. And then, it wasn't, and it didn't just come out of nowhere. I mean, the Bitcoin prehistory, over about 40 years, all the puzzle pieces were generally falling into place. So I would describe digital scarcity as a discovery. It's something that if we were to rerun civilization over and over again, we would eventually come across it. Obviously, the details of the implementation are an invention, but it's based on essentially discovery. Um, and so this is something that exists now, and there's plenty of tools that either are new or they're resurrected because of this technology. And what that can do is that really changes power structures. Basically, it gives people wherever they are, as long as they have some connection to the rest of the world, some internet connection, for example. So it's a fairly low bar. It's not ubiquitous, but as long as they have some connection, it's possible to choose money that's different from what their environment offers them. Banks are, like central bank ledgers are these permission closed systems, and then for a bank to build on top of it, you need permission in that country. But Bitcoin is this open source foundation, is permissionless, so communities can come along and pool their resources and build effectively, like a full reserve bank on top of it, and basically give themselves all these tools to work with. And they can use, they can pool the resources with people online from other jurisdictions or in their own jurisdiction. There's really good privacy technology. So in this era of kind of central ledgers, authorities got really accustomed to surveillance. If you go back far enough, they didn't really even have the technology for surveillance. Like even if you were a malevolent king centuries ago, the thought that you could just surveil everyone's transactions wouldn't even occur to you because it's like people are just exchanging bare assets. There's minimal ways to do that other than, when we started doing banking. And when all of us started using banking and like we're all getting a regular paycheck and everything kind of throughout the 20th century, they could just attach this really big surveillance apparatus to it, and that became normalized. So we went from privacy being normal to surveillance being normal, and if someone wants privacy, they're kind of viewed as like a weirdo or they're up to no good, or what do you have to hide? And I think that some of these technologies can reassert privacy as normal, which of course can have frictions, as you kind of impact with regulators, and people have to kind of come to terms that there's a new technological reality here. But that goes back to the earlier point of how technology is upstream of things. Like people can complain about financial surveillance, but that's just kind of how things were until there's technologies that can, from a bottom-up perspective, in a decentralized perspective. So it's like a hydra where it's just you can chop one head off, like you can go after Tornado Cash or Samurai wallet, and I would defend those people, if possible. But the better thing you can do is kind of give them tools so that anyone can have privacy for their own community, and of course process law against people that actually break laws rather than just privacy for its own sake. So I think it's a really exciting time because here in 2024, some of the things are really coming together to make this ecosystem really workable compared to even how it was a few years ago.
Yeah, and I think one of those key examples, just to go back to Fedi, is Fedi. They just launched yesterday. And speaking of the kind of Hydra, and I think it's such a great analogy for open source technology in general. You cut off one head, two more pop up in its place. Like you're not going to kill this thing. You're just going to make it adapt, right? And Fedi made the announcement they're already source available and then going fully open source with their whole combined technology stack. The underlying components were already open source. Bitcoin is open source. The Lightning Network, Nostr, Matrix, fedimint, the federated Ecash protocol. But nobody had put all of that together into one super app yet, which is what Fedi has done. And I'm really just there's a couple of threads here from what you just said that I think weave right into Fedi, which is one is just the centralization of money in general on these big ledgers, fractionally reserving out these systems. With Fedi, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like this could be almost a move back towards an even more decentralized free banking style era, but with a better reserve asset, with more auditability, with more, I guess, with more capability, certainly, but also with so much more privacy. And I'm wondering if you can, as Ego Death, you guys are investors in Fedi, and you've obviously been very supportive of this tech. And as investors, usually you don't want your companies you're investing in to make their solution completely open source. Usually you want to, keep that IP. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you guys, as investors in this technology, in this putting these together, were okay with them going open source, and why that's really kind of so important as we move forward?
So when we invest in Bitcoin companies, obviously we want to do well financially, but we also invest in things that we think are good for Bitcoin because that makes all the investments better. It makes Bitcoin more valuable. It makes the companies they can work together, and now they're more valuable because of it. Bitcoin companies are a fairly collaborative space. Even sometimes Bitcoin companies are technically competitors, but for the most part, there's a lot of collaboration because it's like we're all in this together. Um, and open sourcing this technology makes it, especially when you're talking about, a fairly sophisticated piece of software, you want to be able to audit it. And then also, you want to just have it out there so that, people can do it differently if they want to. We don't want to have one company have like a monopoly over federated mints. There's plenty of different implementations that people can do, and I think that strengthens it long term. It makes people trust it more. It makes people kind of really feel confident that the technology is out there. Even when we there could of course be frictions with regulators and things like that over um, privacy technology in general is something I think is going to be a battleground for a long time. I think that Bitcoin's been doing very well in terms of store of value. I think governments are coming around increasingly to like viewing that as credible. But as a payment tool, and especially as a private payment tool, that's where I think there's still gonna be a lot more frictions. So certainly open sourcing it kind of it gives it to the world, but then of course there's still a lot that goes into a company. It's not just your idea, it's not just your software, it's all the operation. It's all the on the ground work they do. So there are a lot more than just code on a computer or on a phone. Um, and that's it's funny. Like I remember in 2022, when I was just hearing about this idea of Fedi, and it was like there are certain ideas that I hear that are just so interesting, and I know that idea is going to have legs to it. And so that it's certainly been one of the more exciting investments, I would say.
Yeah, it's I was loving watching the launch and got a chance to talk to Obi just the night before and was itching to share that because it's just I had taken a little bit of a deep dive into it, but there's nothing quite like having someone like Obi explain really the rationale behind these things. And I think that that's such a the focus of Fedi really is on enabling communities to have the tools to be able to operate as they normally would, but just way more efficiently, way more productively, and just to ultimately be able to save a heck of a lot of time by giving them a much better solution than what they currently have. And I think that as we go forward here, I think perhaps a lot of people from the outside looking in say, "Oh, this is a neat tool for people in the so-called developing world." But it seems to me that this is technology, especially on the privacy, near perfect privacy side, which is enabled by Chaumy and Ecash, that this is something that people in the so-called developed world will also have a great need for. Do you have any sense of just kind of where you see this going, how you see this technology expanding, not just in the, okay, high trust communities, but as a more generalized tool for people, especially as we get into an era of, it seems to be never stop, or, nothing stops this censorship train. Nothing stops this surveillance train. How do you look at all that? And so not just as a tool for communities, but as really a true freedom technology tool.
So I think you described it earlier well, in the sense that it's kind of like the free banking era, but in the digital age, which makes it more auditable and more private, and basically just gives a lot of freedoms back to communities. When we talk about Bitcoin scaling in general or Bitcoin usability, there are different levers you can pull to have a much better experience. And one of them is to realize that, of the 8 billion people in the world, we're not all lone wolves. We might not trust the government, we might not trust some other entities, but there are people we do trust. And so being able to choose who you trust and then even decide to trust them in the minimal way, like you might trust them with custody, but not surveillance, for example. And that's what these types of tools enable. They allow people to have more control and pool their resources together in a way that's scalable, that's private, that's actually easy to use. It feels like Wallet of Satoshi, except instead of everyone's, like Wallet of Satoshi, but it's like instead of everyone Bitcoin in one big honeypot, that can be surveilled and rugged. It's like you distribute it, more broadly, hopefully, and in more private context. I mean, basically, in a developing country where banking access is not super high and the monies they have available are usually worse. And in Africa, there are over 40 currencies. In Latin America, there are over 30 currencies. So imagine all of the cross-border frictions, right? There's a lot of international trade that happens, and all of those are friction points. Imagine if in the United States, if every state had its own currency, and like you're trying to buy something from this other thing, or and like you're imagine running a business in that environment, and you have parts from all these different places, and it's all different currencies. That's what they find themselves in, and this is cross-border, good uniform money and then different interoperable communities building on top of it. And they can customize their own, community federation the way that they want. It's an open source and there's mods to it, so you can have a really simple one that just has chat and money. There's other ones you can have all you can do it for data storage, so you're not just pooling your resources for money, you're pooling your resources for things like data storage and compute. You can access AI through it and pay it with Lightning, for example, in some of these communities. And I think that's really powerful. And there's certain milestones that Bitcoin went through. Like first it's invented, then it kind of gets bigger over time, more liquid, more credible. Then the Lightning Network gets developed, and for the first few years, it's not really usable in practice. It's low liquidity, a lot of payments fail, but then it builds more and more connections, and by like late 2020, early 2021, I kind of recognized, okay, this is actually becoming an inflection point, a usable medium of exchange. Then a couple, more liquidity, more technology building on top of it. And then when you take 40-year-old Chalmy and Mint technology and you realize, okay, it was applied to the dollar, so it was like building on sand. It didn't really work in that environment, but if you can apply it on granite, basically Bitcoin, it's actually a profoundly useful technology. Um, and even if you're in a developed country, so you don't really have too many payment frictions for the most part, it's nice not to have everything you do surveilled. I mean, people when they talk about privacy, they often think of the government, but it's just corporations spying on you. Like all these social media companies, all these financial companies, they want to spy on every one of your transactions and have a big data profile for you, so they know how to advertise to you and know how to kind of influence you in ways that can extract value from you. And so often you're not their customer, you're their product. Um, and what this does is kind of gives you more control. If I want to spend on something or spend on this other thing, I don't really want someone over my shoulder watching everything I'm spending on. And this gives that capability to people, hopefully, worldwide. I mean, there's obviously some places might have more frictions than others. And the cool thing is you can join a federation that's not in your area. I mean, I think that ideally it's community based, but they're also online communities, and so people can kind of reach around and access it however they can.
Like Lyn points out, open source companies make the Bitcoin ecosystem better for everyone. So if you want to support a based open source company and get a fantastic piece of hardware in the same time, go to bitbox.swiss/Walker and use the promo code Walker for 5% off the fully open source, Bitcoin only Bitbox O2 hardware wallet. Then get your Bitcoin off the exchange and into your own self custody. You may have seen people talking about the Dark Skippy attack on X, which is a way for a malicious signing device to leak your private keys. But luckily, Bitbox is one of the only two wallets to actually address this vulnerability. So you're in luck. Plus, the Bitbox O2 is easy as hell to use, whether you're brand new to Bitcoin and it's your first time setting up a hardware wallet, or you're a seasoned psychopath. And again, it's Bitcoin only and fully open source. You can head to Bitbox's GitHub and verify that for yourself. There's no need to trust me or to trust Bitbox. When you go to bitbox.swiss/Walker and use promo code Walker, not only do you get 5% off, but you also help support this podcast. So thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really powerful idea, but it's not just an idea anymore. It's in practice now. They are live globally. You can go to fedi.xyz and download this, and it's really cool. And it's a beautiful UI. It's a really easy experience to wrap your head around for a non-technical person. Like you don't need to worry about any of kind of like, this isn't like setting up a Raspberry Blitz in 2020 to use the Lightning Network. Like this is made it very easy. And there's trade-offs with everything, right? And I think that's something that perhaps a lot of Bitcoiners who say, it's got to be Bitcoin on-chain self-custody or nothing. This idea that you've got this pristine digital asset, this with absolute scarcity. It is just a perfect store of value. Why would you risk any of its beautiful store of value properties to try and mess around with it as a medium of exchange? That's just kind of like, yeah, we'll get there eventually, but it's really not important now. Do you have where do you sit in that kind of nonstop and ongoing debate between we need to focus on Bitcoin as a pristine store of value, or we need to focus on Bitcoin as a medium of exchange because that's what's necessary as well? Or are you somewhere in the middle? How do you wrap your head around all that?
So I think it's both, and there's obviously discussion points there around both custody and around store of value versus medium of exchange. So for the broader topic of store of value versus medium of exchange, the order that this has kind of gone so far is first it was like a digital collectible, then it was like a niche medium of exchange. So like in a say, WikiLeaks, for example. That's something that really before it had material value, it was already serving that purpose. Then it starts gravitating more toward store of value. And then, basically the order of operations there is that you have a network effect issue where if not many people hold an asset, then not many people want to receive an asset unless there are other things get cut off, right? So as people have larger cash balances in Bitcoin, they're more likely to accept Bitcoin. And then the medium of exchange, I think, comes over time. But you do want to look out a little bit and make sure the tools are available to help that process come more smoothly and come more efficiently, because that can then circle back and make the store of value concept stronger, right? I mean, basically, when you look at billions of people around the world living in troubled jurisdictions, every time someone in like Venezuela is able to like leave their country with some of their net worth intact, that's been a success for Bitcoin. It helped them. It also advertises why this does have value. It's not just people playing with their Bitcoin's magical internet money. It's actually helping people in different countries in either oppressive environments or inflationary environments. It's helping companies, be able to store value in something that doesn't melt away over time. And so I think that that comes organically, and I think the store of value reaches scale before broad medium of exchange. Like, when we wake up, we don't look around and think like me and I have so many payment frictions, right? Now, in certain environments they do, but it's not really a top 10 thing we're worried about. Um, Whereas, so for like people in developed countries, usually the store of value is a much bigger thing that people are worried about. How does build wealth and store it into the future for their children? That's a really big deal. And then some people do have the more immediate payment frictions, and then they might gravitate toward medium of exchange earlier. Also, obviously, tax burdens are a huge impact. If Bitcoin was legal tender, I would have my Bitcoin would have much higher velocity, certainly, if I didn't have to have an accounting overhead of that whole situation. Um, and so I think that that's like realistically going to hold it back for a period of time. But there's 200 countries in the world. There's plenty of jurisdictions. We want the tools to be available, and that helps that happen. Um, and then as far as custody in general, I tend to view it through the lens of optionality, in the sense that people should have the option to, opt out if they need to or want to into whatever kind of as much self custody and as they want. But it doesn't mean that we're trying to optimize necessarily to always be in that state. It's kind of like, for example, if I have a bulletproof vest, why wouldn't I wear it every day? Right? In case, right? But of course, there's frictions and expense to do that. It's uncomfortable. There's a cost to it. Um, so I don't want to walk around in a bulletproof vest every day. If I was a reporter on a war zone, then that's an environment where I might want to do that. And so, for example, for long-term savings, I think self-custody is a very important thing for a lot of people, and it should be. But for working capital, like the amount of money that you'd walk around in your wallet, for example, your physical cash in your wallet, or maybe to a bigger extent, how much you have in your checking account, kind of like your month's worth of liquidity, for example, or a couple months worth of liquidity. There's layers of how much security that are appropriate for different contexts like that. And because there's a cost to higher security, and there's frictions there that has to be offset by the risk of things. So, for example, I don't think people should put themselves in an environment where their life savings can be rugged, by someone else. But if your wallet cash is rugged by someone you trust, that's a different level of a problem, and there's potentially recourse against that. And so I think there's different solutions for different risk models. And one of the powerful things you can do is trust people in your own community. That enables you to pool resources, and everything gets easier. It's division of labor, right? So instead of everybody being their own like techie and managing everything, you can say, well, there are certain people that want to do this. They live and breathe this stuff. So let's have them run something, and then we can make use of it. And if they show signs of breaking that trust, we can go elsewhere. We can diversify our trust. And then if we have a lot on the line, that's when we, ideally want to pull it into other forms of self-custody. It could be your own Lightning channel, or it could be cold storage on-chain multi-sig with distributed keys, depending on how much we're talking here.
Oh, so it just made me think. What was that meme you had the other day? It was like you're worried about Bitcoin price volatility. Like I've got geo-distributed multi, wallets or keys in different countries. So it just made me think of it. It was a great meme. Well done there.
I try.
Uh, you know, it, I think such an interesting thing about Ecash generally, and especially in this federated model, that is difficult for people to wrap their minds around a little bit is, okay, people think, okay, they hear Ecash, and I think there's a misconception that this is like you're creating some shitcoin, basically. Like this is some sort of tokenized Bitcoin, but it's more nuanced than that. You're creating a bearer instrument because Ecash is actually a true physical, well, digital physical bearer instrument that you can actually exchange offline, even with those animated QR codes that Fedi has, which is just kind of mind blowing that can work like that. But you have this thing that is really actually, I mean, as the name implies, functioning as cash. Like it really does function as cash. Also, in terms of that privacy preserving nature of cash. Like cash is still just about, I mean, it's as private as you can get, right? If I hand you a $5 bill and nobody's looking, nobody knows that $5 bill has changed hands. And basically, these federated mints, as I understand them, are essentially the same way. Not even the guardians of these mints have the ability to see what is, who is sending what to whom. It's just bearer assets changing hands. And I think that that's a really, I don't think the majority of people, even within Bitcoin yet, who are actually tuned into this, have fully appreciated that. I'm just coming to fully appreciate it. And so that means that probably still 99 point whatever percent of the world who is not as tuned in really has no idea that even something like this is possible. Do you see, outside of, I guess, the current implementation of Fedi, it is an extensible solution, right? You can build basically layers on top of this. Do you see other kind of really high value use cases, maybe as it relates to the integration with Nostr, as it relates to, where Ecash can be used for these private, instant, truly lightning fast settlements that nobody from the outside can see and that are completely bearer in their nature? Like that is just money changing hands and nobody else is, any the wiser. How do you see that, I guess, expanding out or kind of changing the dynamic in these other realms, like Nostr, for instance?
So I think Ecash and Lightning as a combination is super powerful. It's one of the most effortless ways to move value around. And in practice, it's not as complicated as it sounds because you just you have your wallet. It's got a balance in it as far as the UX is concerned. It feels like Wallet of Satoshi in that sense. Now under the hood, it's a bunch of Ecash tokens, but you just view it as a balance. And you have all these extra capabilities that a normal custodial balance does not have, like you mentioned, offline transfer. There's trust trade-offs when you do that, but it's an option for spotty internet areas and other frictions. And so I think that's like a pretty revolutionary building block. All these things coming together, um, and I just in a digital age, it's just the nicest way to send around money. Like literally, like on this call, we could literally bounce sats back and forth, which we can't do with our dollar payment systems. We can't do it with anything else. We can only do it with this type of open source, super fast, super easy technology. Um, I think Nostr and Bitcoin kind of benefit each other because I mentioned this in my Nostr article. Nostr is a really good payment discovery tool for wallets. It gives Bitcoin wallets Venmo-like capability where like I could just look you up and pay you rather than being like, hey, like what's your address or like how can I, it's a big public payment directory with its kind of own built-in like fraud detection because you can look at followers, you can look at the whole web of trust. And so it's like this organically building payment directory that makes all wallets better. I think that's super powerful. So even if Nostr takes a long time to take off as like a serious rival to big centralized social media, the fact that it's there as this like alt media with its own payment directory, it's already super relevant. It's already making my wallets better, and it's already like a fun place to post and really positive environment. Um, and then I think what we're seeing recently is that Ecash can also make Nostr better. I mean, basically, we already know that payments make social media better because it's less about engagement, it's less about views, and it's actually more about value being transferred. So whether it's Lightning or whether it's Ecash exchanging hands, it's just super valuable. And then we're seeing that people are finding ways where you can just like put Ecash on someone's like public key, and then they can claim it with their private key. I just think that this is a really useful parallel ecosystem. Nostr is not as like bulletproof as Bitcoin, where it's like, fully consensus state, but there's this, set of relays out there and all these clients connecting to relays. And so we have this kind of data availability matrix out there that makes Bitcoin better and then is better because Bitcoin exists. So I think that's a super symbiotic, healthy intertwining ecosystems that go really well together. And I would encourage people that are into Bitcoin that aren't on Nostr. Like I get, it's not as active as Twitter, for example. I can see why some of them wouldn't want to post every day. But having an account there, understanding how it works, understanding the technology, and then maybe using wallets that either make use of it or can make use of it, is it's just super powerful. So I would encourage people to really try out Nostr.
And you've been a super vocal proponent of Nostr. And by the way, I say Nostr. I also say hodl instead of hodl. So these are just hills that I'll die on. But I just wanted to throw that out there. But that's the beauty of things that are open source in nature, right? You can kind of somewhat make up your own rules. I don't know. But I digress. But you've been a super vocal proponent of Nostr for quite some time now. You've been incredibly active on there. You've also gone the route of saying, look, I post some more unfiltered types of thoughts on Nostr than I will on X or than you will on your website. And, I'm kind of curious because you made a very compelling pitch to Bitcoiners. I think Bitcoiners right now are the majority of folks who are on Nostr. Not only talking about Bitcoin, talking about many things, but for people that perhaps have somehow stumbled upon a podcast called The Bitcoin Podcast, but are not Bitcoiners yet, what is kind of your value proposition to folks from, okay, I'm not into all this Bitcoin stuff yet. Maybe I'm interested in it, but like, why would I try out this new social media thing that only has a couple of users? And I've already got my Instagram. I already have my X. I already spend hours a day on TikTok. Like, I don't need another social media. Why would I bother?
I think there's a couple answers to that. One is it's backup, right? It's a broadcast medium that only you control. As long as there are some relays out there, and anyone can run a relay, but as long as this interconnected ecosystem is functioning in some way, you have this like unstoppable broadcast voice that can't be corrupted, it can't be stopped. And not only is it permissionless, but it's self-verifying because it's your client is using your key to like sign that it actually is from you. People don't really think that, like Twitter could literally just send out tweets from my account that's like, even if there's not a hacker, right? That obviously people get hacked, but even just Twitter as a company could start tweeting in my name, or Instagram could do this, right? It's kind of like it's hard to prove that I actually authorized the tweet going out. Whereas Nostr, if you control your own key, there's really no way to send out like unauthorized content. So especially in a world of AI and bots that are probably only going to get more sophisticated. Um, it's a pretty big deal. So one is backup, and two would be you want to not like you want to be on the right side of technology. So I think it's at a right time where it's good to familiarize yourself with this. It's kind of like how everyone should just know how Bitcoin works, even if you don't like it. Like it's just something you kind of should know how it works, and know roughly how banks work and how this is different. I think it's good to know um, basically how it works, because I think that we're probably gravitating in that type of direction. And so you might as well be a little ahead of the curve. The Another thing that's I think going to get more attention over time is the algorithms. So people increasingly know that social media is not great for our mental health in general as like a species. And some of that is just being online, but another part is like we get stuck in these big centralized algorithms, and they want to advertise, they want volume, they want a lot of activity, and negativity tends to sell. So the more that we're online arguing with each other and engaging with each other, the more we're drawn to it. Some of the times I post most of the day is when I'm having a debate with someone. And that's what pulls people in. And a cool thing about Nostr is that there's no central authority like setting the algorithm for that ecosystem. Different clients can have different ways of helping you discover content, and what content will be prioritized. And in the future, I think we'll see marketplaces for algorithms. So even on one client, you could choose to have different types of algorithms to help you discover and manage and sort through content. And I think that in addition to being useful in Nostr, I think that could give ideas to other ecosystems to basically say, well, if that's on Nostr, why can't Twitter have that too? Why can't there be different algorithms to choose from, or Facebook or Instagram? Why is it only a couple options? Like on Twitter, they did a thing where you can just like turn off the algorithm, and you can kind of do the for you feed or just your followers feed. So some of them have some options, but imagine if you had a whole multitude of options for how content is prioritized for you. So I think that in addition to being a tech stack, it's an idea, and I think that idea is going to gain traction.
Yeah, and I think people people really don't fully understand what these just rage bait algorithms are really doing to them. I mean, you get a feeling of it when you find yourself suddenly you've been on X for however long, and you realize I've just been looking at a stream of things that kind of like make me low level a little irritated, either because it's a really dumb opinion I don't agree with, and then I engage with it, and then it feeds me more dumb opinions I don't agree with, and you're kind of at the mercy of these algorithms. You really, if you are conscious of it that it's happening, then okay, you can be a conscious user of this product and find your way around it a little bit better. But I think the vast majority of people have just become so accustomed to it, so accustomed to these algorithms that it feels like, well, there is no alternative. This is just how it is. It feeds me this and I digest it. And I I'm kind of curious of your thoughts as it relates to the Nostr tech stack more generally. What sorts of applications, use cases are you really excited for as Nostr progresses more? Because yes, right now it's kind of like a build what you know thing. Social media is a really natural kind of first step for this protocol, but it is just an open protocol. You can build anything you want on it. It's a protocol for communication. It's notes and other stuff transmitted by relays. So what are you looking at in the next few years? Maybe it's the next 5, 10 years that you think are things that will really be massively beneficial that can be built on top of this open source stack.
So I think technology always goes in directions we don't really. It can be really hard to foresee what directions. It might be that the killer app is something that no one's really even talking about yet, and we didn't really put the puzzle pieces together. So I would have kind of low confidence in my own opinion about what gets built on Nostr over the next 5, 10 years. At least for now, I think that the fact that like any type of social media you like, whether it's Twitter or Pinterest, basically, or anything in between, you can have that kind of front end with a big interoperable back end to all the other ecosystems, which is really cool. So I think I mean, that's a massive idea. And then I've been really prioritizing that payment discovery, payment directory aspect, because it already makes wallets better. And now like, and actually it was the initial kind of alpha version of Fedi, where I realized how important communication is inside your own wallet, right? I mean, like, commerce involves communicating with someone and trading that value with someone. And so when you have communication and money transfer together, that's super powerful. And Nostr can add that to any wallet. And so it's like, I would kind of look now at any wallet and think, like, why does this have a communication element to it? I mean, like, I'm just in this wallet alone. Like, how am I going to use it, right? And so having that inbuilt communication is super valuable. It makes wallets better. Basically, everything becomes international open source Venmo. Um, and you can still have privacy elements to it, right? I mean, it's not like you want all your payments to be Zaps, but just like you can look up their payment information in Nostr and then send a non-Zap Lightning payment to them. And wallets can do that for you. And so I think that's still low key. Like, I don't think people have appreciated that yet. Obviously some have, but I think that idea is just huge. Um, I would like to see how it changes long form content. I mean, it's not just short stuff. It's like basically Substack too. Um, the highlighter project, for example. Um, and we can still, I guess, lump that into social media, but it's a more longer form, substantive type of social media. So those are already just massive revolutionary concepts. Um, I think that having just relays out there is just it's useful for data availability. It's useful for potentially data backup. And we already saw, for example, Ecash making use of the fact that there's relays out there kind of holding information until we kind of get back and claim the eCache. Um, and so I'm hesitant to kind of think out further than that. It's got inherent protection against forgery because you're signing all the content, which I think is going to be increasingly relevant. I think that reviews could be a lot better. Because imagine every time you go to a review site, you see all the numbers, but then imagine if like your friends' reviews are at the top, and you like we don't really social weight reviews right now. Like we used to, like in the age of movie critics, we kind of did that. Like if Roger Ebert says this is a really good movie, and you generally like his hit rate as it ties in your taste, that you're socially weighting his review higher. Now in the internet age, we really look at like Rotten Tomatoes and think, okay, is this, we look at the critic score, the audience score, you look at IMDb, you kind of get some like metrics for is this thing popular or not. But imagine if I'm looking at this like show and it's like, Walker says this is awesome. He rated it 10 out of 10. I would think, well, maybe I should check that out. And I was posting the other day about Blue Eye Samurai on Nostr, and literally one person's review just said this is amazing, and I was like, I didn't even hear about that. I'll watch that. So it's like one review was, and then I looked it up, and they had really good reviews. So it's like this kind of both the quantifiable and someone who they like this other show I like, and they just said this is the best thing they watched in a while. So I'm gonna weight that review. That's like 20,000 reviews in my book, right? That one review. So I think reviews and any sort of like anything that kind of just sorts things basically is adding your own web of trust to quantifiable metrics and having them together. I think super powerful.
I think it's such an interesting thing that we're using these technologies that are basically in like the whole idea is to remove the intermediaries, right? To remove these ideas of trust. But in so doing, we enable ourselves to actually build trust within the smaller communities within these protocols or that develop around these protocols. Like, because you don't ultimately want to live in a society where there is no trust. Like, you want to live in a high trust community. There's going to be, in a physical sense, you're going to have less crime, less littering on the streets, things like very tangible things.
Yeah.
And in an online community, you have much more, I guess you have a much higher sense of, okay, the information that I'm getting is of much higher value because I have a much higher level of trust, not only in the people that are giving me that information, but in the fact that, yes, those people are actually those people. Like there are so many different, I mean, you have, I shudder to think how many different imposters across so many different platforms. And yeah, I think you have imposters on Nostr too, but it's very easy for me to see which one is Lyn Alden because I know I'm following Lyn Alden. I can check your, I can check your Nippo 5. I can look at all these different things. Oh, who's following? And I can make sure, yes, that is in fact Lyn Alden. The protocol enables me to have more trust in the people and to build greater trust in these online and physical communities. And I just think that's such a beautiful thing. I'm curious if, what your thoughts are on just kind of the idea of like confrontational truth. It's something I talked to Pablo F7Z about, and he's saying that Nostr, because it is truly free and open, it really enables, like through his like Wikipedia project, this idea of confrontational truth. Whereas when you have these centralized gatekeepers to any source of information, like Wikipedia, for example, you're still very much relying that centralized organization, and also sure some more decentralized contributors to it, but ultimately there's a central organization running it. You're putting a lot of trust in them to curate proper information, and there is not very much confrontational truth. There's almost no confrontational truth or search for it in legacy media. So in this time where, I mean, we're in an election year here in the US and in many countries around the world, censorship. We all got a very, very strong taste of how that can look during the COVID times for things that, were not supposed to be said at the time that later turned out to be actually okay to say once the truth came out. But in an era where confrontational truth seems to be under threat, how do you see this playing out? Like, do you see, I mean, is Nostra just still far too small to actually make any sort of a meaningful impact in that? Or are we going to see in this next kind of election cycle, are we going to see more people start to look for alternate sources to communicate, ways where they can still have that real confrontational exchange of ideas that is so necessary for actually trying to ascertain what the truth is?
So I think that it's not too small for the people that use it, right? So everything starts at the
True.
individual level. If someone's using Nostr and getting value from it, it doesn't matter how big it is. I mean, right now it's like, you have tens of thousands of active daily users. It's valuable for them. I guess it wouldn't be valuable if it was like 5 people, but as long as there's some sort of community there, and it's certainly big enough to be a community and multiple overlapping communities, it's already big enough for those people. Obviously, in order to have a broader scale, it's got to be bigger and the ideas got to spread. And like I said, even some of the ideas could spread to other non-Nostr ecosystems like algorithm choice. Like Bitcoin as software, in addition to providing us the like actual physical, like it's a working network, but it's also an idea, right? It's an idea that we have now of like open source money and our own, we control our own money, move it around. It does not get inflated, right? It's unstoppable. That's something that we all like appreciate now. And I think Nostr can have a similar thing where the software is making it happen, but then also it's changing our idea of what should be normal. Um, and it's also a emphasis of how important technology is because I mean you have people debating how much should we censor, and one way to just end that debate is just make things uncensorable. Like this, it doesn't matter what they think because it's just if there's enough people using Nostr and it's a working kind of freedom web of communication, and then of course algorithms to help you sort it, to make sure it's usable. Um, then that's it. Just kind of ends the debate. It doesn't matter what people think about censorship if you have good enough technology to make it really hard to censor. Um, and so I think that over time can shape things. I think that one of the things we as a species are going to have to come to grips with is like just dealing online in general because it's kind of like how we went through this with our food. Like we're very detached. Like we're eating things that we're not really evolved to eat, and therefore we have health issues because of it. And so people over time have had to make more conscious decisions. Kind of the whole rise of like paleo or paleo adjacent diets. The idea of going back to something is in semblance of what we used to eat, like real food. And I think we're going to have to do that at some point with our online interactions, which is that we're not really evolved for that environment. Where like someone in another country can just say you suck, and then you feel bad for the rest of the day. Because it's like, when I walk outside my front door, it's a high trust society. There's no one saying like, "Hey, you suck," or, like I hate your work. And like even if the people online that say you suck, if you actually meet them in person, they will rarely say you suck. It's like the instincts are off. We don't have it's communication without the social cues. Um, and I think that over time we're gonna hit kind of a rock bottom in terms of like mental health and just unproductivity because of that and pull back in another direction. And I think Nostr kind of like Nostr is like the kind of like how paleo was like a movement in like real eating. I think Nostr is kind of a movement toward taking back that control, being conscious of the algorithm, constant like conscious of attention maybe not being the best currency and maybe actual currency is a better currency than attention. And I think that it is going to take a long time, but I think that's an initial foothold that's both a technology but then also a broader idea and awareness of what social media is doing to us, and not just on an individual level but like on a national level. Like it now affects like mobs and stuff because like you can rile people up, um, in like all sorts of ways. And I think that it's healthy to hopefully have the pendulum swift back a little bit, and people not only have the capability, like the technology gives us the capability, but then the mindset of treating online environments more like real life and constructing them with that in mind.
I think that's really beautifully put, and I like the getting back to the paleo analogy, but for our online discourse, I think that's fantastic. And you know, if you go on X these days, you will see a more tweets, or I guess just posts now, than you could ever imagine, discussing the problems that we have in our society, in our politics, with how expensive things are, with how much unrest there is. You see so many problems discussed. I find that you also see very few legitimate solutions put forward. And when there are, quote, solutions put forward, they're typically political solutions. Some form of the solution is ceding control to a central authority to, hey, fix this, please. And there's less of addressing the underlying problem. And I think part of that is that maybe most of the time, as systems get more centralized and also just more complex, it's difficult to fix a massive, entrenched, broken system from within that system. You need to force change from the outside, from a parallel system, and force that change in the current system through external pressures. And the title of your book, Broken Money, you get at a lot this idea, and we talked about this earlier, this broken money being at the root of a lot of different things. Now, I'm curious, this is sort of a slight gear switch here, but we can all acknowledge that our money is broken. You know this far better than the vast majority of the world, but luckily you wrote a book to help people understand it, and a great shorter YouTube video, which I'll also link in the show notes because it's fantastic for anyone who hasn't seen it. But we've seen now a little bit of a tide shift where there's more, it seems, public acknowledgement, even from politicians, that yes, something is really broken here with our money. You've got the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, saying this is, unsustainable. And now you have even politicians proposing things like a Bitcoin strategic reserve. I'm really curious of your thoughts on this whole Bitcoin strategic reserve for a country like the US as an idea. Like, do you like this? Do you think this is good for some folks, bad for others? Will this actually happen? Do you think that furthermore, there's a chance that something like this actually entrenches some of the broken elements of our system or aids in the rise of private stablecoins that function as de facto CBDCs? I know that I just threw a lot of different things out there, so apologies for that. But maybe just to start, what's your read on the whole Bitcoin strategic reserve as an idea? Do you think it has merit? And what holes do you pick in it?
So I think it's natural that any large pool of capital that understands Bitcoin is going to want to accumulate it, whether it's individuals, whether it's organizations, or whether it's governments. All else being equal, I'd rather smaller entities get there first, which is generally the direction you go in because it's only, when you're making a decision for yourself, your family, it only takes one or two people to make that decision. If you're making a decision for a small company or a company that's like still run by the founder, there's a few more checks involved, but still it's a fairly quick decision. Very large publicly traded companies and governments are inherently slower actors for the most part. And so kind of the natural order of things is that it starts small. In addition, I mean, the liquidity wasn't really there until the past few years. It just wasn't a big enough network to be interesting to corporations and governments. Now it is, and even then, I mean, they if Germany can move the market, for example, they would have a tougher time moving the market for bigger assets. So when Bitcoin's 10 times bigger than now, it'll be even more interesting at the nation state level. And so I think it's although I prefer and the general direction is smaller entities first, it's just inevitable that if large pools of capital figure it out, they're going to get there. And I also think that it provides, like one of the risks people fear about, when you think, okay, what's the next 5, 10 years look like? It's governments, say, for example, going after Bitcoin. And I think that the network's very resilient to that, but it doesn't mean Bitcoiners are. Most people don't want to have to move to be able to, play with their Bitcoins. And, it's like you want to have political cover. You want to have support. Ideally, you don't want to have a hostile environment around it. And so I think that that government interaction is important. I don't really have a strong opinion on the strategic reserve. I think, if my job was to run a corporate treasury, or run a national treasury of some sort, I would add Bitcoin. Um, and it's like I would, put it in a certain amount so it's like the volatility is not, like a problem for what I'm trying to do. It depends on what perspective you're looking at. Obviously, if you're a cypherpunk, that's not like you're probably your top focus. You're more like you want to build technology to make it move around between individuals easier and more private. So I think that it's natural that some people are going to focus on that. That's what politicians and that's what big pools of capital, Wall Street, they're gonna kind of focus on that store of value element, um, and other people can focus elsewhere. I mean, part of why I like the venture work is that in some ways it brings back my engineering days because first I was, building stuff and then I had to increasingly kind of like delegate that. And so instead more like allocate capital to engineers building stuff internally. And now, you know, it's instead of just complaining about how things work or just saying end the Fed or if we only had this one political leader in charge, it can fix everything, right? Instead of doing all that, we can actually go and build things or help other people build things in parallel because we have a lot of really powerful building blocks now. And so whether it's donating to open source development on things that might not be return based. It might not be economic, but it's more like you think it should exist. That's absolutely a really good path. Or there's some things that are really good in company form. That scale is important, and so you can invest there, and it becomes helping people build things. So that's what interests me more than say something like a reserve. But the reserve is like a useful idea. The fact that politicians are talking about it, that means they're not talking about banning it. They're talking about whether or not they should buy it, whether it's a bad idea, a good idea. Let them keep talking about that so that we can build all the medium of exchange and community elements and really good user experience and payment discovery. Let them keep talking about how big or not big the reserve should be. Is I think that's a good thing that's happening.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. It's the fact that the Overton window has shifted that much to where the discussion is primarily about, you know, who has the more bullish Bitcoin strategic reserve strategy from of the politicians that are running for, like, it's just kind of insane
Yeah.
that it's at that state. And I want to dig into a little bit more just the venture work that you do, because you guys, in terms of the companies that are publicly listed on your site, you've got Fedi, you've got Breeze, Relay, Wolf, Sonoda, and LN Markets, I think, are the ones that are public. Can you talk about any of those, or maybe just you talked a little bit earlier about your sort of why you guys are supportive of open source development, because a rising tide lifting all boats. What do you look for in companies in the Bitcoin ecosystem, and maybe for other venture firms who may be looking to get into this? How do you see this developing? Do you think that this is really a seriously undervalued, investable segment right now, or is it fairly valued at the moment? How do you guys look at this? How do you choose what companies to pick, and what are you really excited about for those?
Yeah, there's a pretty big range of valuations because there's different types of money that pours in. So right now, for example, a lot of the roll-up type research, I would say the valuations are high there. There's like crypto money kind of coming in, whereas some of these more traditional Bitcoin companies, I think that there's pretty reasonable valuations on the market, and that there are a lot of ideas that are worthy of capital. I think that it's kind of at a place where I wouldn't say there's a deluge of too much capital, not enough ideas, and it's not like there's a ton of ideas that probably should get capital that aren't. I think there's a decent amount of balance to it. Um, and what EgoDeath focuses on is leading deals. So rather than just passively writing a check, we help a whole round come together. We organize other investors. We do kind of this really deep diligence on it, and then we more directly work with founders. So one is we look, okay, is the company, is it scalable? Is it likely to provide good returns? Is it good for Bitcoin? Do we wake up feeling good that we're a part of what they're doing? And then it's, can we add value to them? Are we the right partner for them? And are they receptive to the type of help we can provide. There's some companies that maybe we're not the right fit. Maybe they want help from other people, or maybe they don't really want much external help, and there's not really much we can do besides capital. There are other times where they want those other inputs besides just capital. Um, and then there's also a pacing thing. So this goes back to medium exchange versus store of value and unit of account and all that. Like, what is the kind of the expected order of operations here? What gets big enough to have a venture-backed company before other things, right? So, for example, it could be actually challenging to have a venture-backed company built around cypherpunk stuff because historically the market's not been super big for that, right? Whereas like store values, that's a really big market. Um, and so I think it's not just saying, okay, this is a great idea, I want it to exist, but it's like, is this a big enough market over the next 5 years to have a company really, kind of building it out, or is it so small or uneconomic such that it's better with donations, right? So I mean, I like to donate to open source development as well for ideas that might not be right for a business, but then there are other things that are right for a business. So yeah, we look for companies that are, you know, we're pretty geographically spread out. We even have the more companies than a couple more that are not listed there yet. Looking at all of it together, there's many different countries and continents involved. And it's basically is just making Bitcoin easier for people to use, either dealing with consumers or be business to business or kind of infrastructure that kind of ties other companies and other users together. Is basically trying to help create the vision we want instead of just complaining about the Fed. Let's put capital to work and build this really powerful ecosystem. And so whether it's Fedi, whether it's Breeze, whether it's LN markets, they're all kind of providing value to different parts of the market.
And again, I guess it's back to this idea of instead of just complaining about the entrenched system, it's actively building the parallel system and trying to affect change there where it's much easier to do. And let's say your sats go along quite a long way. But there are still obviously there are a lot of Bitcoin companies now. I think one day there will be perhaps every company is in some way a Bitcoin company. And you sort of wrote a recent piece. I think either just today or yesterday you released it. A new look at corporate treasury strategy. I'll link this in the show notes as well for anyone who wants to read the whole thing. But I thought this was quite interesting, and you have an excellent way of a very let's say engineer's mindset in terms of how you structure things, because it always, by the time you get through it, you're like, well, I don't know how you argue with that. But can you talk through that a little bit? Because it seems that this is obviously, you guys invest in Bitcoin companies, but this is direct advice for any sort of company. You started off with just kind of this idea that, okay, the balance sheet versus the income statement, and how the balance sheet has sort of lost some of its importance in recent years. Can you talk a little bit about that idea and actually why that happened, why that did lose so much importance versus the income statement?
Right. So basically, corporations, both legally and just what's available to them, they don't have really good savings assets. They hold like T-bills basically, and money markets and basically cash-like instruments as their savings. And there's really not that many good like other options. And so the problem is that in that environment, they're not incentivized to save because if a company is holding a lot of cash, that cash is not doing as well as what we expect from equity returns. So it's like instead of like good for the company, it's actually like an anchor on the company. You'd rather have them pay it out in dividends or put it into buybacks so you have a bigger share of the company. You want them to put that capital to work, which is a shame because it creates risk. A company without a balance sheet, if it's got no savings or limited savings, the company is entirely valued on its future earnings, which can fluctuate wildly. And the problem is it can be nonlinear. So if the company runs into a problem that impairs their earnings, and then they're trying to raise capital to fix the problem, well, now that capital is going to be very expensive because they didn't have any savings. Their balance sheet doesn't matter, and all that matters is their future cash flows, which are now impaired by whatever they're trying to fix by raising capital. Um, and so we generally see, like universities last centuries, uh, and they have these big endowments that can kind of get, you never really see like, oh, this university went bankrupt, because they have really big savings stacks. They have capital that can last them for a long time, whereas companies on average have shorter time frames, partially because they're not incentivized or allowed to really save. And even gold is not really good enough, because it gets diluted over time by more creation. So I mean, if you had to hold gold or dollars for 5 decades, you probably should pick gold. Um, but it's still not enticing for corporations because it doesn't keep up with equity returns. Um, and it doesn't keep up with broad money supply growth. And so having something that's even harder than gold, but that's also easier to hold and move around and things like that, really it's a super powerful tool for treasuries. And that even goes back to the nation state question, which is there are nation states that are holding trillions of dollars of like U.S. treasuries, and so we're slowly rug pulling the national savings of basically every country. Um, and they can hold gold as an option, and many of them do. That means like no one can literally rug pull. Like no one can like just take their assets unless they go in there and get them. But then also they don't really get diluted as quickly. And Bitcoin's basically that on steroids. It's the type of gold that doesn't get diluted at all in the long run, and it's basically gold in the 21st century. So in addition to being a really powerful payment network and all those features, it fixes corporate balance sheets, it fixes national savings, it fixes household balance sheets. As long as someone has a thesis that there's a high probability that this technology continues to function, the incentives work, the network gets stronger. Um, and so I think it's powerful. The biggest downside to that all is its volatility. But in order for Bitcoin to become relevant, it has to get bigger. We like upward volatility. We like number go up, and we don't want it to take a century. We wanted to, so it's got to have upward volatility. And anytime any asset with upward volatility is going to have downside volatility. If it only had upward volatility, people would just lever it, and it would just go to the moon. And it wouldn't, it has to kind of shake off that leverage from time to time. And so whenever there's upside volatility, there's euphoria, there's leverage, and then there's downside volatility, there's fear. And so you can't really, that's a inescapable part of the system until we reach a scale that's closer to its total addressable market. I would say right now we're at a tiny fraction of its total addressable market, and so it trades like an option. It trades like this, what is the chance this becomes relevant a decade from now is how many big pools of capital view it. Um, and so the downside of that volatility is most companies or individuals can't use it as their only savings asset, because what you don't want to have is like a 70% drawdown, and then you have to spend it while it's drawn down, right? So it's like it's there's unfortunately a little bit of a privilege there in the sense that the generally the wealthier you are, the more volatility tolerance you have, and so that's like a kind of an unfortunate just reality. But basically, it gives it so that at least for a portion of your savings that you don't intend to spend for the next 4 years, it's one of the best assets that someone could hold. And people, you know, like a lot of my readers would think, well, why can't they just hold the S&P 500, or why can't they hold, XYZ? But I don't get that question in Egypt. When I go to Egypt every year, their options are real estate, which is now overbuilt because everybody picks real estate, gold or physical cash dollars that are melting ice cubes. Um, the local stock market's not very good. It's very volatile and not as well returning as S&P 500, and it can be hard for people to invest overseas if they're like in the middle class or working class. Wealthy investors can always move capital around, but normal person often has trouble. And then do you really want to invest in another nation's stock market, right? I mean, do you want to like have is that your primary savings? You technically now you're ruggable by an international entity. Um, and so Bitcoin is just this really powerful savings technology for literally every level of society, from the household to the nation state.
I think that that's such a powerful thing that this isn't just something for rich people in rich countries. or something just for poor people in poor countries. This is something that goes across that spectrum. And I'm kind of curious, just on the corporate side of things, do you foresee that there's, in the U.S., for example, we've had a lot of focus, obviously, on companies like MicroStrategy, who was quite pioneering in this effort in terms of a big publicly traded company making this move. We've also seen a few other publicly traded companies like Semler Scientific. They recently announced, you've got Metaplanet in Japan. There were a couple others whose names I'm now forgetting in the U.S. more
Block
recently.
does it.
They've been
Yeah.
doing it for a while as well. Yeah, and so do you think, is there a profile of the type of company that is going to try this type of strategy first? Like MicroStrategy, you've got Saylor, who was the CEO and one of the the founder. Obviously had a little bit more leverage, perhaps, even though it's a publicly traded company. Is there a culture that needs to be present for this to even be a possibility? Or is there an industry that's particularly well suited to this because of the dynamics of that industry and how their money moves around?
So I think that the profile is basically companies that are still run like a smaller business, which is to say, like the founder is still there, or a super long time CEO that can just kind of make decisive action, that is not worried about their quarterly bonus, right? They own a lot of their own equity. They care about what that equity is going to be priced at 10 years from now. They don't care about what it's going to be priced even next year or next 2 years. And because the career risk is a really big thing, whether you work in governments or finance. No one wants to be the one that like puts Bitcoin on the balance sheet and then it gets cut in half, because they're mainly thinking about their own career. They're not they think about their family, they think about their career. The organization they work at is like a third priority. But if it's like the thing you founded and you have a massive amount of equity in it, you really care about what that organization looks like in 10 years. And so and that's what small businesses are like. Some, one person or a handful of people own a private business, and so already been a lot of adoption of Bitcoin among small businesses. There's a lot of them that have done it, and just fewer in the publicly traded, because most of them are run by, like the CEO is not like a big owner. He or she cares about the next several years, but that's really all their visibility. So it's been held back by accounting issues. There's also banking issues. Like only recently did really these big institutional custodians, become around, right? It's not like years ago. Imagine if a corporation like put their treasury and try to have Mount Gox hold it or something, or and basically there just wasn't really institutional capacity until Fidelity got involved, and then just NYDIG and Coinbase Institutional, these kind of like more um, kind of serious type of security. And then there's even like banking relationships that are hard, right? You can't just like wire money through, like they all use these big banks. These big publicly traded companies use a handful of really big banks, and those banks are often not very friendly to Bitcoins. It's like you have to go around them through like a smaller bank, which a big corporation doesn't usually love. So there's basically frictions. um, so I think the key profile is the CEO has to get it and be high conviction and be able to is incentivized to think 10 years instead of 1 or 2 years. Is probably the main set of things. And another thing I would point out is that if it's not the CEO, then what happens is like there's like a critical mass that doesn't matter until it matters. Like if a board of directors is like 9 people and like 3 of them are like quiet like Bitcoin enthusiasts, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's 0 or 3. It only really matters when you get to like 5. And so all throughout like corporate America, there are like individual directors or like vice presidents, that are like really into Bitcoin. Like I was giving a talk at like a technology company, really big one, the other day, and the vice president is like super base. Like he's running his own Lightning node. Um, he's like way into Bitcoin. And the company has, it's like there's people like him throughout corporate America, and they're just like a minority. So either basically what happens is the CEO gets it, and then they're super high conviction, so that's Fidelity or MicroStrategy, um, you know, eh, things like that. Or I think the longer route is just gradual critical mass until it's normalized. So it really comes down to does a company want to be a leader or does it want to be a follower? And then the other kind of incentive is like, if you're super big and successful, why change what's already going amazing? They're not really thinking in that capacity. Whereas if you're like kind of a stagnant cash flow positive value stock, like that's what MicroStrategy was. They weren't really growing. They were profitable, kind of a niche software business at that point, against really big competition. I mean, the fact that they actually made it that far compared to all the other business intelligence firms, but it still just it wasn't great for their, forward future. And there are like thousands of companies in that state where like they sell widgets and the widget market isn't getting bigger. It's not going away anytime soon, but so they're not really building toward anything. They're not really going to go outside of the circle of competence and compete elsewhere. And so one of the things you can do is just dominate the widget industry by adding Bitcoin to your balance sheet. And then you get way more attention. You get, if Bitcoin's successful, your balance sheet goes up, then you can really buy your competition at that point. Um, and so I think it's kind of like the ones that are struggling, not in terms of like acute struggle. Like if you're not profitable, you probably shouldn't be like buying Bitcoin. But if you're like profitable and stagnant and don't really have this like super competitive moat, that's a really good profile for companies to buy Bitcoin and say, well, we can't really do much about the income side of our company. It is what it is. That's the market. But we can do something about the balance sheet side. Instead of holding a bunch of melting ice cube T-bills, or instead of decapitalizing ourselves so that we set ourselves up for failure if we ever have a big problem in our industry, we can buy something that has it's the best performing asset. Really, it's kind of competing with Nvidia as like the best thing you could have bought over the past 10 years. Um, and you can just have that, and it can dramatically change the kind of the trajectory of your company.
Do you think, just on that note of early adopters of this corporate Bitcoin strategy, do you think this has the you talked about maybe these types of companies, they're performing well, but they're not really growing. But then over a few years, if they have Bitcoin on their balance sheet, they end up being able to just acquire their competition. Do you think that has? I mean, are we going to see a large reshuffling in the years to come, both at the corporate level and perhaps at the nation state level, the have Bitcoins and the have nots? And does that ultimately lead towards more consolidation and centralization as some companies just have far more capital to deploy because their capital has actually been it has been growing its purchasing power dramatically since, while the competitions, whatever they're holding, it hasn't been growing at nearly even close to that rate.
So I mean, Silicon Valley is kind of an interesting example because, wealth compounded in the tech sector faster than elsewhere. And so in, say, the United States, the power used to be really in like the Northeast, kind of media, finance, and then all this tech created tens of trillions of dollars of wealth, large on the West Coast. And so you had now kind of competing nodes of power. And I think that, Bitcoin right now, it's something like $1 trillion asset. I mean, if it's a $10 trillion asset or a $20 trillion asset, that's a comparable rise. And yeah, we created a lot of new billionaires and a lot of new millionaires that can, but it wouldn't be as physically concentrated. It'd be around the world, fortunately, kind of like in their own communities. Um, and so I generally view that as a positive. I don't really view it as centralizing because it's hard to get more centralized than things are in the sense that right now, the bigger company you are, the lower cost capital you have. Your stock literally becomes monetized. Like literally, people just stuff money into their 401k, usually in market cap weighted passive indices. So every day, every week, you blindly just give Apple more money um, and make their equity more valuable so that when they pay their employees partially with their equity, they just have a really strong position. They can borrow money for like as low cost as the U.S. government can. Um, and so that's already very centralized, and that's part of why big companies have eaten smaller companies, is because in addition to economies of scale, they've got that capital advantage, which is it's absolutely huge. Um, and in a long enough timeline, if Bitcoin is money, it removes that, right? So being bigger often does have advantages. But if you're not like competitive and you're not still stacking sats, then you're going to start losing your treasury over time. And so I don't really view it as centralizing. I do view it as over time like not destabilizing but restabilizing, like in the sense that it just reshuffles, power, kind of like how the rise of Silicon Valley, changed power structure in the US. I think the rise of Bitcoin can change power structures globally, and it gives little, like, places like El Salvador, uh, because they're like on the front of that train. They can get disproportionate benefits as long as they manage that pretty well by basically saying, look, we're going to hold Bitcoin. We want Bitcoin-based companies to be here. Um, and then they can really benefit from that. And like I think the UAE is figuring that out. There are a handful of countries around the world that are like, so I think Singapore is kind of figuring that out. There are a number of places that are saying like, there's what's there to lose compared to what's there to gain from having a foothold here.
I think it's that idea that ultimately Bitcoin will flow from net consumers to net producers, and the only way to stop that flow is to become a net producer yourself and to continue creating value in a competitive way. And Lyn, I said I wasn't going to ask any macro questions, but if you have time, I do have one kind of. We don't have to go super deep on it, but just with it's been a heck of a year we've had this week, and you now see all of these calls for emergency rate cuts. To talk of the ultimate net producer of government paper or private bank cartel paper, the Federal Reserve. They are a small group of people who basically control the price of money. Yes, in the U.S., but that ripples throughout the entire world. What is your read on kind of what happens next? We're also in an election year where typically, well, I guess it depends on who's in power, but typically they don't like people getting too angry before the election because they don't like people to see everything, the cracks in the system right as they're about to elect somebody. Do you have a sense of where we go from here in terms of, are the Fed's hands tied at this point, and do they need to just start cutting these rates, even though and do we see an adjustment to the perfect level of inflation of 2%, as folks like Paul Krugman have called for?
So I think that the calls for an emergency rate cut don't really make a lot of sense. They don't really care about the stock market going up or down by a few percentage points. That's just not their focus. I think people over-index how much the Fed cares about the stock market in the immediate sense. Where you would get more immediate action is if something hits the core financial plumbing, banks, repo, treasuries. When a problem is there, that's when like they're in there in like 24 hours. That's where um, all hands on deck. They will not let destabilization be sustained. Whereas stock market flailing around for a while, unless it gets bad enough that it starts hitting those core markets, um, emergency rate cuts are not a good look. That's not something they want to do unless they really had to. During COVID or something, they were like, obviously it's an issue. So I think we're probably going to get rate cuts in September. Um, it's there's a lot of kind of market issues with rates where they are. It's making the deficits even worse. I think they're probably going to go down. I think that they're going to be in a situation where eventually their hands get tied. Right now, they're so like in Japan, for example, the central bank is really limited to what it can do. Um, because the government debt is so big, the deficits are so structural. If you raise rates meaningfully, the deficit gets absolutely silly, and then the one that would have to buy it is them. So the more they raise rates, probably the more QE they have to do, um, and so they have a limited option. The United States is like entering that phase, but it's not as far along as Japan. So there's like periods of time where they have options. They seem like they're in control. But when you run the math out a handful of years, you can see where they're not really in control. Like the New York Fed is already projecting that by the end of 2025, they're probably going to go up to back to balance sheet growth again. Now, they wouldn't view it as QE because they wouldn't be viewing it as economic stimulus. They'd be viewing it instead as growing the balance sheet in line with nominal GDP, and kind of maintaining this like higher reserve environment that we've had ever since the global financial crisis. Um, and so I think that it gets awkward when they go back to structural liquidity adding if inflation is still officially above their target, um, because then there's not really good answers. Right now, that whenever there's like inflation data points or something, the market says, well, now the Fed's got to be tighter, that they're going to handle this. Whereas if they kind of get shown is like they literally just they don't really have control of their balance sheet anymore, or issues like that. I think then you can get a pretty radical shift in how people approach their view. I think still, people are still in the mindset of a lot of stuff happened after COVID, it's normalizing now, but I think there'll be increasing awareness of how structural this is. So I think that in the coming months, probably see some rate cuts, no emergency cuts unless something really deteriorates. Something has to hit those core markets to do some sort of like kind of either liquidity addition or um, rate changes. And I think that in the future, the balance sheet might be as big of a component of all this as the interest rates. Um, and a lot of like if you look at like Egypt's base money, it's like high inflation. Look at their base money; it's going up substantially, and it's like they don't really. It's hard to get that the wheels to slow down there. And I think the United States could find itself in a similar situation in the years ahead, where the deficits are too big. The more they raise rates, the more it blows out the deficit, which they end up partially having to buy. And so their overall ability to put out fires starts to get like worse. It's kind of like putting a kitchen fire a kitchen fire out with water. It doesn't really work, ironically. I think that they could find themselves in that situation.
Does anything stop that train?
Nothing stops that train. And part of why that's the case, one is its political polarization, so it's locked in. One of the things they commented on a recent research report is that in the Republican Party, they on their platform they say we're not going to cut Social Security or change the Social Security retirement age. Um, that used to be a Democrat position, right? It used to be that the Republicans kind of wanted to trim and cut that to some extent. The Democrats didn't. Now it's like we've moved past that era. This isn't like the Paul Ryan Republican Party anymore. So both sides, the few things they agree on are don't cut the military, don't cut Social Security, don't cut Medicare, and you can't cut interest unless you default. So and that's already that is like roughly equal to the tax receipts. Um, and everything else is like marginal. So that's not going to change for a while. And then two, the United States is our tax receipts are more tied to asset prices than most other countries. It's part of like tax changes we did in the 90s, where like a lot of executive compensation, it gets a better tax treatment when it's like equity based rather than cash based. In addition, we have just more wealth concentration in general, which means there's more wealth and income tied to asset prices. And so if we try to do austerity and like the stock market, struggles under that environment, ironically that hurts tax receipts and blows out the deficit, which makes austerity very hard to do. The reason why nothing stops at train is it's not just pulling a couple levers, it's a restructuring that would have to happen. So I don't think that train stops until there's like a significant overhaul to the way the financial system works and to the value of the dollar.
Well, I appreciate the analysis, and I had to ask at least one macro question, so I appreciate that. I want to be conscious of your time, so the last question I would ask is just more of a general one. You get doom and gloomed a lot, as we talked about earlier in the YouTube thumbnails and things, and I think today we've stayed very, very positive, and I really appreciate your take on just all of the incredible development that's happening in this space, how you see it personally, and then also as an investor. And I just want to know, more generally, just what makes you hopeful for the future? What makes you really excited about the years to come?
So certainly the technology plays a big role, like liking the work you do, being able to get up every day and either write and educate about a topic, which involves educating myself first. I mean, one of the best ways to learn is to teach. Um, so it's that component, and then it's basically saying, I want this thing to exist. Therefore, I'm going to help it exist. I'm going to help, find people who can make it exist and see if they well capitalized, right? I mean, it's just like, or bring more attention to it so that other people might help capitalize it. So basically, the fact that what gives me hope is that we have some degree of control of our future, that we can build things rather than just ask for things to change around us. Um, and also, it's funny because I'll talk about like inflation or fiscal issues, and people in the West will often say like, "Oh, that's like a Mad Max scenario. Like that's awful. Like that's the end of the world." And it's like, when I was in Egypt and there's like 30% inflation, my relatives are still taking their kid to childcare. They're still running their small business. They're still serving as a doctor in a hospital. It's like life gets messier, but it goes on, right? So it's like, people often think end of the world scenarios for fairly small things. Like if you mention 9% inflation, they're like, that's insane. Or what do you mean the Fed would like go back to balance sheet increases while inflation's above their target? Or, it's like that's not even remotely comparable to what other countries are dealing with on a regular basis. And they're still going through normal life in for the most part, outside of like really dark places of the world. Um, and so life can get messy, but it goes on. So we have the tools. Things are rarely as bad as long as we don't like fire the nukes. We should be okay here. We don't build like a super virus because now like AI can, those are the kind of things I guess I worry about is like if everyone has like an AI that can build viruses or kind of things like that, we've kind of distributed power. That's it's one of the downsides I guess, but avoiding tail risks like that, life goes on and there's plenty to do.
So we're all going to be okay. Well, not all of us maybe, but if we pay attention and try to educate ourselves and to teach others, there is a lot of hope, I think, for the future. Despite how, certain the algorithm may have you believe otherwise, but there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful.
I think so. I think basically, go outside, get sun, touch grass, meet people in real life, try to act online how you act in real life, try to be conscious of the algorithm in a similar way that we're trying to be conscious about food more and more. I think a conscious life can be a hopeful life.
That's a wonderful note to end on. Last question, I promise, but very quick one. Are you reading anything right now besides I would recommend Broken Money. I'll link that in the show notes. Is there anything that you are reading that you're really enjoying?
Not right now. I'm looking forward to an upcoming Brandon Sanderson book, which I'll be probably diving into. Lately, I've actually been kind of looking through technical stuff. Like I was looking through the Nostr GitHub, things like that. I've been a little bit more on the technical side recently than the literature side. I had a little bit of a lull in terms of literature, but I plan on getting back to that probably in the year ahead.
Oh, just a little light reading on GitHub. I love it. Where should people go? LynAlden.com, Lyn Alden contact on Twitter. I think you're primal.net/Lyn. I'll double check that, but I'm pretty sure. Anywhere else you want to send people?
That's it. Yeah, and check out Broken Money wherever books are sold.
Awesome. Well, Lyn, thank you so much for your time. This was extremely enjoyable, and I'm glad we got to talk some white pills here today.
Yep. Thank you.
And that's a wrap on this Bitcoin Talk episode of the Bitcoin Podcast. If you are a Bitcoin-only company interested in sponsoring another fucking Bitcoin podcast, head to bitcoinpodcast.net/sponsor. If you're enjoying the Bitcoin Podcast, consider giving the show a 5-star review wherever you listen, or sharing the show with your friends, family, and strangers on the internet. Or don't, Bitcoin doesn't care, but I always appreciate it. You can find me on Nostr by going to primal.net/Walker. If you want to follow the Bitcoin Podcast on Twitter, go to @TitcoinPodcast and @WalkerAmerica. You can also find the video version of this podcast at youtube.com/@WalkerAmerica and @WalkerAmerica on Rumble. Or just go to bitcoinpodcast.net/podcast and find links everywhere. Bitcoin is scarce. There will only ever be 21 million, but Bitcoin podcasts are abundant. So thank you for spending your scarce time to listen to another fucking Bitcoin podcast. Until next time, stay free.